The bullet that grazed Jacob Sutton's shoulder in the summer of 1876 was the least of his concerns as he rode into Knights Ferry, California, with blood seeping through his shirt and a determination to never trust another living soul again. The small mining town sat nestled along the Stanislaus River, its wooden buildings weathered by the relentless sun and the dreams of men who had come seeking fortune only to find dust and disappointment. Jacob had no such illusions about gold or glory. He had come here because it was far enough from Texas, far enough from the memories of betrayal that still burned hotter than the wound in his shoulder. At 28 years old, he had seen enough of the world to know that the romantic notions other men clung to were nothing but pretty lies designed to make fools of anyone stupid enough to believe in them. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Dust, carried him down the main street with the patient determination of an animal that had traveled hundreds of miles and knew rest was finally near. Jacob's dark eyes scanned the buildings, taking in the saloon, the general store, the livery stable, and what appeared to be a small boarding house at the end of the street. His black hair hung past his collar, and several days of stubble covered his jaw. He knew he looked like trouble, and that suited him just fine. The livery stable was run by an older man with a limp and a suspicious eye. Jacob paid him for a week's board without much conversation, then grabbed his saddlebags and rifle before heading toward the boarding house. The afternoon heat pressed down on him like a physical weight, and his shoulder throbbed with each step. He would need to clean the wound properly, but first he needed a room and maybe some whiskey to help him sleep through the pain. The boarding house was a two-story structure that had once been painted white, but now looked more the color of old bones. A hand-painted sign hung above the door reading "Clean rooms, fair prices, no nonsense." Jacob appreciated the straightforward message. He pushed through the door and found himself in a small entry room with a desk, a staircase leading up, and a narrow hallway that presumably led to the back of the house. Behind the desk sat a woman who made him stop in his tracks, though he would have died before admitting it affected him in any way. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun that nonetheless couldn't quite contain the wild curls that escaped around her face. Her green eyes looked up from the ledger she had been writing in, and Jacob felt the full force of her assessment as she took in his blood-stained shirt, his trail-worn appearance, and the hard set of his jaw. "I need a room," he said, his voice rough from days without much conversation. "You need a doctor," she replied without missing a beat. Her voice carried a firmness that surprised him, given that she couldn't have been more than 5.5 feet tall. "That blood on your shirt is fresh enough to tell me you are still bleeding. I will handle it myself. I just need a room." She stood up, and he noticed she wore a simple dress of dark blue cotton that was practical and well worn but clean. "This is my establishment, and I do not need one of my boarders dying in the night and causing me trouble with the sheriff. You will see Doc Morrison, or you will find somewhere else to stay." Jacob felt his jaw tighten. He had been giving orders to men for the better part of a decade, first as a ranch foreman and then as a trail boss. He was not accustomed to being told what to do, especially not by a woman who looked like a strong wind might blow her away. "Lady, I have dealt with worse than a graze from a bullet. I know how to clean a wound." "Perhaps you do," she said, coming around the desk to stand in front of him. Now that she was closer, he could see the faint freckles across her nose and the stubborn set of her chin. "But that does not change the fact that if you want to stay here, you will follow my rules. I have built a reputation for running a respectable, safe establishment, and I will not have it said that I let a man bleed to death under my roof because I was too cowardly to insist he see a doctor." "Cowardly," Jacob repeated, almost amused despite his exhaustion and pain. "Nobody has accused you of that, I would wager." "Not twice," she said, and there was something in her eyes that told him this was not an idle boast. "Now, are you going to see Doc Morrison, or are you going to get back on your horse and find some other place to sleep?" Jacob knew when he was beaten, even if he resented admitting it. "Fine. Where is this doctor?" "2 buildings down above the Mercantile. Tell him Nora Jenkins sent you and that I expect him to give you proper care." "Nora Jenkins," Jacob said, committing the name to memory. "And you run this place." "I own it," she corrected him. "There is a difference. I will hold a room for you until you return. If Doc Morrison says you are fit enough to stay here without risk of sudden death, then we can discuss terms." Jacob wanted to argue further, but the truth was his shoulder hurt like hell, and the world was starting to blur slightly at the edges. He had lost more blood than he wanted to admit during the long ride into town. "I will be back," he said, and headed back out into the afternoon heat. Doc Morrison turned out to be a balding man in his 50s, with steady hands, and a no-nonsense attitude that reminded Jacob uncomfortably of Nora Jenkins. He examined the wound, cleaned it with burning alcohol that made Jacob's jaw clench hard enough to hurt, and pronounced that the bullet had indeed only grazed him, but that it had taken a good chunk of flesh and would need to be properly bandaged and watched for infection. "Nora sent you?" the doctor asked as he wound clean linen around Jacob's shoulder. "She did. Said she would not have me dying in her boarding house." Doc Morrison chuckled. "That sounds like her. She is a good woman, runs a tight ship. Lost her husband 3 years back, took over the boarding house, and turned it into the most respectable lodging in town. Some men thought they could take advantage of a young widow, but she proved them wrong quick enough." Jacob filed this information away, trying to ignore the unexpected curiosity he felt about Nora Jenkins and her history. How did her husband die? Mining accident. Terrible thing. They had only been married 2 years. She could have gone back east to her family, but she chose to stay and make a life here. Takes strength to do that. The doctor tied off the bandage and stepped back. "Change this every day, keep it clean and dry. If you see red streaks or feel fever, you come back immediately. Understood?" "Understood. And do not let Nora's small size fool you. She once held off 3 drunk cowboys with nothing but a shotgun and her determination. They were trying to break into the boarding house to harass one of her female boarders. By the time the sheriff arrived, all 3 were sitting on the ground with their hands up, sober as judges and apologizing profusely." Jacob paid the doctor and made his way back to the boarding house as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The heat was finally starting to break, and a slight breeze carried the scent of river water and dust. When he pushed through the door, he found Nora still at her desk, though now she was mending what appeared to be a tablecloth. She looked up, her eyes immediately going to his properly bandaged shoulder visible beneath his open shirt. "Doc Morrison took care of you." "He did. Said to tell you I am fit enough not to die in the night and cause you trouble with the sheriff." The corner of her mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Good. The rate is $2 a week, paid in advance. That includes a room with a bed, clean sheets once a week, and 2 meals a day. Breakfast is at 7, dinner at 6. If you miss a meal, that is your concern. I do not run a restaurant. No drinking in the rooms, no bringing women of ill repute onto the premises, and no fighting. Break any of those rules and you will find yourself without lodging very quickly." Jacob counted out the money from his pocket and placed it on the desk. "I am not much for drinking these days. I have no interest in women of any repute, and I am too tired to fight anyone. You have nothing to worry about on any of those counts." Nora took the money and made a notation in her ledger. "What name should I put down?" Jacob Sutton. She wrote it carefully, then looked up at him again. Where are you coming from, Mr. Sutton? Texas, most recently. Before that, a lot of places. And what brings you to Knights Ferry? Does it matter? I like to know who is staying under my roof, she said evenly. You do not strike me as a minor, and the ranches around here are not hiring at this time of year. So either you are running from something or running to something. I would prefer to know which. Jacob met her eyes and saw intelligence there, and a wariness he recognized because he felt it himself. Running from something, he said finally, but nothing that will bring trouble to your door. I am not wanted by the law if that is your concern. I just needed a change of scenery. Nora studied him for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling she could see more than he wanted to reveal. Finally, she nodded. Room 4, top of the stairs and to the left. There is a washroom at the end of the hall. Dinner is in 2 hours. I suggest you use the time to rest and clean up. Thank you, Jacob said, and realized he meant it. He gathered his saddlebags and rifle and climbed the stairs, feeling the exhaustion of the past weeks settling into his bones. Room 4 was small but scrupulously clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, a chair by the window, and a small table with a basin and pitcher. The window looked out over the street, and Jacob could see the last of the day's activity as merchants closed their shops and people headed home for their evening meals. He set his belongings down, poured water into the basin, and carefully washed the trail dust from his face and hands. His reflection in the small mirror above the dresser showed a man who looked older than his 28 years, with lines of cynicism etched around his eyes and mouth. He thought about what Doc Morrison had said about Nora Jenkins being a widow, about her holding off 3 cowboys with a shotgun. He thought about the way she had stood her ground with him, refusing to be intimidated despite the fact that he was nearly a foot taller and outweighed her considerably. It was impressive, he had to admit, though it changed nothing about his fundamental beliefs. People let you down. Love was a trap that left you vulnerable. Romance was a foolish notion that led to nothing but pain. His late partner Tom had been a romantic, had believed in true love and soulmates and all that other nonsense. Had married a pretty girl from San Antonio who swore she loved him more than life itself. Then, when Tom died in a stampede 3 months ago, his widow had barely waited 2 weeks before taking up with another man and selling off everything Tom owned, including the partnership share that should have gone to Jacob. He had confronted her, and she had laughed in his face, said Tom had been a fool and anyone who believed in love was just as foolish. Jacob had left Texas that same day, riding west with no particular destination in mind, just a burning need to put distance between himself and the death of his last illusion. He had thought himself immune to such disappointments, had prided himself on being practical and clear-eyed about human nature. But Tom's death and his widow's betrayal had driven home the lesson with brutal finality. Romance was for fools, and Jacob Sutton was done being anyone's fool. A bell rang somewhere below, and Jacob realized it must be the dinner call. He changed into a clean shirt, moving carefully to avoid disturbing his injured shoulder, and made his way back downstairs. He followed the sound of voices to a dining room at the back of the house, where a long table had been set with plates and cutlery for about a dozen people. Nora was setting out platters of food with the help of a young Chinese woman who looked to be in her late teens. Jacob noted the presence of 4 other boarders already seated, 3 men and an older woman. The men looked like merchants or clerks, respectable types in clean but worn clothing. The woman had gray hair and a kind face, and she smiled at Jacob as he entered. "A new arrival," she said warmly. "Welcome, young man. I am Mrs. Patricia Jennings. I teach at the school here in town. Jacob Sutton, he said, taking a seat near the end of the table. The other men introduced themselves as well. Daniel worked at the assay office, Robert was a clerk at the land office, and Thomas ran the telegraph service. They all seemed like decent enough men, the kind who worked honest jobs and caused no trouble. Nora took her seat at the head of the table, with the young Chinese woman sitting beside her. "This is May," Nora said, gesturing to the girl. "She helps me with the cooking and cleaning. May, this is our new boarder, Mr. Sutton." May nodded politely but said nothing. Jacob returned the nod, then focused his attention on the food as it was passed around. There was roasted chicken, potatoes, carrots, fresh bread, and even a pie for dessert. It was simple fare but well prepared, and Jacob realized just how hungry he was after days of eating nothing but dried meat and hardtack on the trail. "Where are you from, Mr. Sutton, Mrs.?" Jennings asked as they ate. "Texas, most recently." "And what brings you to our little town?" Jacob was aware of Nora watching him from the head of the table. "Just looking for a place to settle for a while. I heard Knights Ferry was a decent town." "It is," Daniel said. "Quieter than it was during the big mining rush, but that is not a bad thing. We have good people here, and the land is beautiful." The conversation moved on to town gossip and local events, and Jacob was content to eat in silence and observe. He noticed that Nora spoke little during the meal, but when she did, people listened. There was a respect in the way the other boarders treated her, a deference that went beyond simple courtesy to a landlady. She had earned their regard somehow, and Jacob found himself curious about how she had managed that. After dinner, the boarders dispersed to their various activities. Jacob helped clear the table without being asked, earning a surprised look from Nora. "Thank you, Mr. Sutton." "You did not have to do that. I was raised to help clean up after a meal," he said. "Old habits." "Good habits," she corrected, taking the stack of plates from him. "You should rest now. Doc Morrison said that wound needs proper care, and that means not overdoing things for the next few days." "I will be fine. I have had worse." "I am sure you have," Nora said, and there was something in her tone that made him look at her more closely. "But that does not mean you should neglect this one. Pride is not a substitute for good sense." Jacob felt a flash of irritation. "You do not know anything about me or my sense. I know you rode into town bleeding and exhausted, and I know you argued with me about seeing a doctor even though you clearly needed one. That tells me you are stubborn and used to handling things yourself. Both traits I understand, but both can also get you killed if you are not careful." "And you care about that because," Jacob challenged. "Because I care about all my boarders," Nora said firmly. "This is not about you specifically, Mr. Sutton. This is about me running a responsible establishment and looking after the people under my roof. Do not read anything more into it than that." Jacob felt oddly stung by her words, though he could not have said why. Of course she did not care about him specifically. They had only just met. He was nothing to her but a paying customer. "Understood," he said curtly, and headed back upstairs to his room. The next few days passed in a haze of healing and restless frustration. Jacob was not a man accustomed to inactivity, and the forced rest grated on him. He changed his bandages daily as Doc Morrison had instructed, pleased to see that the wound was healing cleanly with no signs of infection. The pain lessened with each passing day, but the boredom increased proportionally. He took to sitting in the chair by his window, watching the life of the town unfold below. He saw Nora coming and going on various errands, her quick stride and determined expression making it clear she was a woman who did not waste time. He saw May hanging laundry in the small yard behind the boarding house, her movements efficient and practiced. He saw the other boarders heading to and from their jobs, reliable as clockwork. On the fourth day, Feeling stronger and tired of his own company, Jacob ventured out to explore the town properly. Knights Ferry was small but thriving in its modest way. The mines in the surrounding hills still produced enough gold to keep the town alive, though the days of wild prosperity were clearly long past. The buildings were well maintained, the streets relatively clean, and the people he passed seemed content if not wealthy. He stopped in at the general store and bought tobacco and a few other supplies, making conversation with the proprietor, a heavyset man named Samuel, who seemed to know everything about everyone in town. "You are staying at Nora's place?" Samuel asked when Jacob mentioned where he was lodging. "I am." "Good choice. Best boarding house in town, maybe in the whole county. That woman has worked miracles with that place. Her husband, God rest him, ran it before he died, but it was nothing special then. Nora took it over and turned it into something respectable. She is fierce about maintaining standards, but that is exactly what makes it work." "She seems capable," Jacob said neutrally. "Capable," Samuel chuckled. "That is one way to put it. She is one of the strongest women I have ever met, and I mean that in every sense. Some men in town thought they could push her around after James died, thought a young widow would be easy pickings. They learned different real quick. Nora Jenkins does not back down from anyone, and she does not tolerate nonsense." Jacob made his purchases and left, but Samuel's words stayed with him. He found himself paying more attention to Nora over the following days, watching the way she managed the boarding house with quiet efficiency. She was up before dawn preparing breakfast, spent her days cleaning and maintaining the property, dealing with suppliers, handling any issues that arose, and still managed to have dinner ready precisely at 6 every evening. She did all this with May's help, but it was clear that Nora was the driving force behind everything. He also noticed smaller things. The way she left a plate of food warming for Robert when he had to work late at the land office. The way she sat with Mrs. Jennings on the porch in the evenings, listening to the older woman talk about her students. The way she gently corrected May's English without ever making the girl feel foolish or ashamed. Nora Jenkins was not just running a business. She was creating a home for people who had none, and she did it with a care and attention that suggested she genuinely valued their well-being. It confused him, this observation. It did not fit with his understanding of human nature, which held that people acted primarily out of self-interest. Nora could run a perfectly adequate boarding house without going to such lengths for her boarders. She could maintain her reputation and turn a profit without the personal touches that made the place feel less like a business and more like a family. One evening, about a week after his arrival, Jacob found himself alone in the dining room after dinner. The other boarders had gone to their various activities, and May had left for the small room she rented above the laundry. Jacob had stayed to finish a cup of coffee, and he was surprised when Nora came back into the room with her mending basket and took a seat at the other end of the table. "I hope you do not mind the company," she said. "The light is better in here than in my room." "It is your house," Jacob said. "You can sit wherever you please." Nora began working on what appeared to be a torn sheet, her needle moving with practiced efficiency. For a few minutes they sat in companionable silence. Then, without looking up from her work, Nora said, "You are healing well. I have noticed you moving more freely. The shoulder is much improved. Doc Morrison said I could start using it normally again as long as I am careful." "That is good news. Have you given any thought to what you will do now that you are recovered?" Jacob hesitated. The truth was he had not thought much beyond getting through each day. "I need to find work. My funds will not last forever." "What kind of work are you qualified for?" "I have been a ranch hand, a foreman, a trail boss. I know horses and cattle, know how to manage men and organize large operations, but I am not sure there is much call for that kind of work around here." Nora finally looked up from her mending. "Actually, there might be. The Thompson Ranch, about 5 miles north of town, has been struggling since old Mr. Thompson died last year. His son inherited, but he is young and does not have much experience. He has been looking for someone to help him manage the operation, someone who knows what they are doing. The position would not be as grand as trail boss, but it would be steady work. How do you know all this? Mrs. Thompson comes to town for church every Sunday. She mentioned their difficulties to me a few weeks ago. I told her I would keep an ear out for anyone who might be suitable." Nora returned her attention to her mending. "I could introduce you if you are interested." Jacob studied her, trying to understand her motives. "Why would you do that? What do you get out of it?" Nora's hand stilled, and she looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "Is it so strange to think I might do it simply because it would help both parties? You need work, they need help. It seems like a logical solution. People do not usually act out of pure helpfulness," Jacob said. "There is always an angle." "Perhaps in your experience," Nora said quietly. "But not everyone operates that way, Mr. Sutton. Some of us believe in helping others when we can, not because we expect something in return, but because it is the right thing to do. I have found that kind of thinking tends to lead to disappointment. And I have found that expecting the worst of people often creates a self-fulfilling prophecy." Nora set down her mending and met his eyes directly. "I do not know what happened to you to make you so cynical, and you do not have to tell me. But I would suggest that assuming everyone has an ulterior motive is a lonely way to live." "Better lonely than played for a fool," Jacob said, his voice harder than he intended. "Is it?" Nora asked softly. "I wonder." She gathered up her mending and stood. "The offer stands if you are interested in meeting the Thompsons. Let me know by tomorrow, and I will arrange an introduction. Good night, Mr. Sutton." She left the room before he could respond, and Jacob sat alone with his cooling coffee and his uncomfortable thoughts. He should have felt vindicated by the conversation. After all, he had successfully maintained his position, made his beliefs clear. But instead, he felt unsettled, as though Nora had seen something in him he preferred to keep hidden. The next morning at breakfast, Jacob told Nora he would appreciate an introduction to the Thompsons. She nodded and said she would send word to them. 2 days later, she informed him that Mrs. Thompson would be in town the following Sunday after church and would be happy to speak with him then. Sunday arrived bright and clear. Jacob had not been inside a church in years, but he found himself standing outside the small wooden building as the service let out, watching families and individuals emerge into the sunshine. Nora came out with May beside her, and she scanned the crowd before spotting him and making her way over. "Mr. Sutton," she said formally, and he realized she was deliberately creating distance between them, establishing a professional rather than personal context for the introduction. "May I present Mrs. Elizabeth Thompson and her son, William Thompson." Mrs. Thompson was a handsome woman in her 50s with graying blonde hair and a capable air. Her son looked to be about 25, with his mother's coloring and an open, honest face that suggested he was earnest if inexperienced. "Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Thompson, this is Jacob Sutton," Nora continued. "He is the man I mentioned who has extensive experience with ranch management." Jacob shook hands with both of them, noting William's firm grip and direct gaze. Whatever his inexperience, the young man did not lack confidence. "Miss Jenkins said you were a trail boss," William asked, "among other things." "I have been working cattle since I was 14 years old. I have managed operations large and small, organized trail drives, handled hiring and payroll, dealt with every problem you can imagine from drought to stampede to rustlers. "That is impressive," Mrs. Thompson said. "We could certainly use someone with that kind of knowledge." "Our ranch is not large, perhaps 200 head of cattle and about 1,000 acres. My husband ran it successfully for 30 years, but William is still learning, and we have had some difficulties this past year." They talked for another 20 minutes, and by the end of the conversation, Jacob had agreed to ride out to the ranch the next day to take a look at the operation and discuss specifics. As the Thompsons departed, he turned to thank Nora, but she had already moved away to speak with Mrs. Jennings. The next day, Jacob rode out to the Thompson ranch and spent several hours inspecting the property, the herd, and the condition of the buildings and equipment. It was clear that the ranch had good bones but had suffered from inconsistent management in the year since the elder Thompson's death. William was willing to learn, but did not yet have the instincts for the work, and some of the hired hands were taking advantage of the situation. By the time Jacob returned to town that evening, he had accepted the position of ranch foreman at a fair wage, with the understanding that he would have the authority to make necessary changes. He would start in a week, which would give him time to settle his affairs in town and ensure his shoulder was fully healed. That night at dinner, he caught Nora's eye and nodded his thanks. She smiled, a real smile that transformed her face and made him forget for a moment his carefully maintained cynicism. Then she looked away, and the moment passed, leaving him oddly bereft. Over the following week, Jacob prepared for his new position. He bought appropriate work clothes and equipment, spoke with Doc Morrison about when he could safely handle the heavy labor the job would require, and observed Nora with increasing fascination that he refused to acknowledge as anything more than idle curiosity. She was a mystery to him, this fierce young woman who had built a life for herself in this rough town through sheer force of will. He found himself wanting to know more about her, about how she had met her husband, what their marriage had been like, how she had felt when he died. He wanted to know if she ever regretted staying in Knights Ferry, if she ever felt lonely in that big boarding house full of people who were not really her family. But he did not ask these questions, because asking would imply an interest he refused to acknowledge. Instead, he watched her from a distance and told himself he was simply observing an unusual specimen of humanity, nothing more. On his last evening before starting at the ranch, Jacob found himself once again alone in the dining room after the other boarders had dispersed. And once again, Nora came in with her mending and took a seat at the table. This time, Jacob recognized it for what it was, a deliberate choice rather than mere coincidence. "You start at the Thompson ranch tomorrow," Nora said as she threaded her needle. "I do." "Are you planning to continue lodging here, or will you move out to the ranch?" "I had not decided." "What would you prefer?" Nora looked at him with surprise. "What I prefer should not factor into your decision, Mr. Sutton. You should do what makes the most sense for you." "The ranch is only 5 miles from town," Jacob said. "I could ride in and out each day, or I could stay there during the week and come back on Sundays. What would be more convenient for you in terms of managing your household?" "If you want to keep your room, I would be happy to hold it for you," Nora said carefully. "But you should not feel obligated. I can easily rent it to someone else if you prefer to move out to the ranch full-time." Jacob surprised himself by saying, "I would like to keep the room if that is acceptable. I find I prefer the boarding house to the idea of staying in the bunkhouse at the ranch." It was true, though he had not fully realized it until he spoke the words aloud. Despite his determination to remain emotionally distant from everyone, he had grown comfortable at the boarding house. He liked the routine of it, the good food, the quiet evenings, and yes, if he was honest with himself, He liked the presence of Nora Jenkins with her quick mind and steady competence. "Then the room is yours as long as you want it," Nora said. "Though I will adjust the rate if you are only here part-time." "That is fair." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the soft rustle of Nora's needle through fabric. Then Nora said, "You have been here almost 3 weeks now, and I have noticed you do not socialize much with the other boarders. You are always polite, but you keep yourself apart. Is that by choice or circumstance?" Jacob considered lying, then decided there was no point. "Choice. I prefer my own company. That must be lonely." "I told you before, better lonely than disappointed." Nora set down her mending and looked at him directly. "Someone hurt you badly, did they not? Someone you trusted?" Jacob felt his defenses rise. "What makes you say that?" "Because I recognize the signs. You have built walls around yourself so high that no one can possibly get through. You expect the worst from everyone, including me, even when we give you reason to expect better. That kind of defensiveness does not come from nowhere. It comes from being badly wounded by someone who should have been worthy of your trust." "You think you have me all figured out," Jacob said, his voice tight with anger and something else he did not want to name. "No," Nora said gently, "but I think I understand you better than you might wish. Because I have stood where you are standing, Mr. Sutton. After my husband died, I felt like I could not trust anyone. I thought the world was full of people waiting to take advantage of me, to hurt me, to betray whatever faith I placed in them. And I was not entirely wrong. There were men who tried to cheat me, who thought I would be an easy mark because I was young and grieving and alone." She paused, her fingers absently smoothing the fabric in her lap. "But I also learned that while some people will disappoint you, others will surprise you with their kindness. And if you shut yourself off from the possibility of disappointment, you also shut yourself off from the possibility of genuine connection. Is that really how you want to live?" Jacob felt something crack inside his chest, some long, frozen thing beginning to thaw despite his best efforts to keep it locked away. "You do not understand," he said roughly. "It is not just one person who disappointed me. It is a pattern. Every time I have allowed myself to believe in someone, to trust them, they have proven unworthy of that trust. My partner's widow, who I thought was a good woman, turned out to be mercenary and cruel. The woman I courted years ago, who claimed to love me, left me the moment someone wealthier came along. Even my own father proved himself a liar and a cheat before he died." "I am sorry," Nora said, and the sincerity in her voice made him want to believe her even as his cynicism argued otherwise. "I am truly sorry you have had those experiences, but surely you can see that shutting yourself off from everyone is not the answer. There are good people in this world, Mr. Sutton, people who are worthy of trust. And how do you tell the difference?" Jacob challenged. "How do you know who will betray you and who will not? Everyone seems trustworthy until they prove otherwise." "You cannot know for certain," Nora admitted. "That is part of what makes trust so valuable. It requires faith, a willingness to be vulnerable despite the risk. But the alternative is a lifetime of isolation, of never allowing yourself to feel anything for anyone. Is that really living?" Jacob had no answer for that. He stood abruptly, needing to escape the conversation and the uncomfortable truths Nora was forcing him to confront. "I should turn in. I have an early start tomorrow." "Of course," Nora said, and if she was disappointed by his retreat, she did not show it. "Good luck at the ranch, Mr. Sutton. I hope it goes well for you." Jacob left without another word, but that night he lay awake in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything Nora had said. She was wrong, he told himself. She had to be wrong. Trust was a luxury he could not afford, and faith was for people who had not learned the hard lessons he had learned. But even as he thought these things, he could not quite silence the small voice in the back of his mind that whispered she might be right. The next morning, Jacob rode out to the Thompson ranch with his saddlebags and his determination to focus entirely on work and forget about Nora Jenkins and her uncomfortable insights. For the first few weeks, he succeeded. The ranch demanded all his attention as he took stock of what needed to be done, made difficult personnel decisions, reorganized workflows, and taught William Thompson the practical skills his father had never had time to pass on before his death. William proved to be a quick learner with a good instinct for the work once he was shown the right way to do things. Jacob found himself unexpectedly enjoying the teaching aspect of the job, the satisfaction of watching someone develop competence and confidence under his guidance. Mrs. Thompson was grateful for the improvements and told him more than once that hiring him had been the best decision they had made since her husband's death. But despite his busy days, Jacob found himself thinking about Nora more than he cared to admit. He returned to the boarding house every Sunday evening for dinner and stayed through Monday morning before returning to the ranch, and he looked forward to those visits more than he wanted to acknowledge. He told himself it was just because the boarding house was comfortable and the food was good, but he knew he was lying. The truth, which he was still reluctant to face fully, was that he had developed feelings for Nora Jenkins. He admired her strength, her competence, her refusal to be anything less than exactly who she was. He liked the way her eyes lit up when she talked about some improvement she was making to the boarding house. He liked her dry sense of humor and her kindness toward May and the other boarders. He even liked the way she challenged him, refusing to let him hide behind his cynicism and self-imposed isolation. But admitting these feelings, even to himself, felt dangerous. It meant acknowledging that despite all his resolutions and hard-won wisdom, he was still capable of caring about someone. And caring about someone meant making himself vulnerable to disappointment and pain. It was early October when things came to a head. Jacob had been working at the Thompson ranch for about 6 weeks, and the operation was running more smoothly than it had in over a year. He rode into town on a Sunday evening, as had become his custom, stabled dust at the livery, and walked toward the boarding house through the cooling air of early autumn. As he approached, he heard raised voices coming from inside. He quickened his pace and pushed through the door to find Nora standing in the entry room facing 3 rough-looking men who clearly had been drinking. One of them had his hand on her arm, and she was trying to pull away without success. "I told you, this is a respectable establishment," Nora was saying, her voice firm despite the fear Jacob could see in her eyes. "You need to leave now." "Come on, sweetheart," the man holding her arm slurred. "We just want a place to stay for the night. Why you got to be so unfriendly?" "Because you are drunk and causing a disturbance. Now let go of me and leave before I call for the sheriff." "The sheriff is not here," another of the men said, laughing. "He rode out to deal with some trouble at one of the mines. Won't be back till morning. So why do not you just be nice to us, and we will be nice to you?" Jacob moved forward, his hand dropping to the revolver at his hip. "The lady asked you to leave. I suggest you do as she says." All 3 men turned to look at him, their eyes narrowing as they assessed this new threat. The one holding Nora's arm let her go but did not back down. "This is none of your business, friend. We were just having a conversation with the lady here." "It became my business the moment you put your hands on her," Jacob said, his voice cold and level. "Now you have 2 choices. You can walk out of here peacefully, or I can throw you out. Your decision." The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly trying to decide if they wanted to test him. Jacob did not move, did not show any sign of uncertainty or fear. He had faced down more dangerous men than these in his years on the trail, and they could see it in his eyes. Finally, the leader of the group spat on the floor and gestured to his companions. "Come on. This place is not worth the trouble anyway." They stumbled out into the night, and Jacob waited until they were well down the street before turning to Nora. She was standing very still, her hands clenched at her sides, and he could see she was shaking slightly with reaction. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said, but her voice was not quite steady. "Thank you. They would not have left if you had not come in when you did." "Where was May? And the other boarders?" "May has Sundays off. She goes to visit friends in the Chinese community. Mrs. Jennings is visiting relatives in Sacramento, and the others are all out for the evening. I was here alone, which I do not usually mind, but those men—" She trailed off, then seemed to gather herself. "Well, they are gone now, and that is what matters." Jacob looked at her more closely and saw the fear she was trying so hard to hide. Without thinking, he stepped closer and gently took her hands in his. They were ice cold and still trembling. "Nora," he said, and realized it was the first time he had used her first name. "You do not have to pretend with me. You were frightened, and you have every right to be." To his surprise, Nora's eyes filled with tears. "I was terrified," she admitted. "I have dealt with drunk men before, but those three, there was something different about them, something meaner. And I knew the sheriff was gone, and there was no one else here, and I thought—" She stopped, unable to continue. Jacob pulled her into his arms without conscious thought, and after a moment's hesitation, Nora leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest. He could feel her heart racing, could feel the way she was still shaking. He tightened his arms around her, offering what comfort he could, and something shifted inside him. For weeks, he had been fighting his growing feelings for this woman, telling himself that caring for her was foolish and dangerous. But standing here with her in his arms, feeling her vulnerability and her need for comfort, all his carefully constructed defenses crumbled to dust. He cared about Nora Jenkins, more than cared, and pretending otherwise was nothing but cowardice. "You are safe now," he murmured into her hair. "I will not let anyone hurt you." Nora pulled back slightly to look up at him, and he saw confusion in her eyes along with something else, something that made his heart race. "Why do you care?" she asked softly. "You have made it very clear you want nothing to do with emotional entanglements. Why help me?" Jacob knew this was the moment. He could deflect, could retreat back behind his walls and pretend this meant nothing, or he could be brave enough to tell her the truth. "Because despite my best efforts to remain detached, I have come to care for you," he said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I told myself it was foolish, that I was setting myself up for disappointment. But the truth is, Nora, you have proven me wrong about a lot of things. About trust, about connection, about whether it is possible to find someone genuinely worthy of caring about. You are fierce and strong and kind, and somehow you have gotten past all my defenses without even trying." Nora's breath caught. "Jacob," she whispered, and he loved the way his name sounded in her voice. "I have been hoping you might feel something for me, but I thought you were too determined to be alone." "So did I," he admitted. "But it turns out I am not as immune to you as I wanted to be. The question is, do you feel anything for me? Because if you do not, tell me now and I will go back to keeping my distance. But if there is any chance you might feel something too." Instead of answering with words, Nora reached up and pulled his head down to hers, kissing him with a sweetness and passion that took his breath away. Jacob responded instinctively, his arms tightening around her as he deepened the kiss, pouring into it all the feelings he had been denying for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nora said. "I have cared for you almost from the beginning. You frustrated me with your cynicism and your walls, but I could see the good man underneath all that armor. I wanted to know that man, wanted to be close to him. But I thought you would never let anyone in." "I did not think I could," Jacob said honestly. "But you made me want to try. You made me believe that maybe, just maybe, trust and faith were not entirely foolish after all." They stood there in the entry room, holding each other, and Jacob felt something he had not felt in years. Hope. Hope that maybe he could have something real with this remarkable woman. Hope that not all love stories ended in betrayal and pain. Hope that taking the risk of caring for someone might actually be worth it. "What happens now?" Nora asked softly. "Now I court you properly," Jacob said, "if you are willing." "I am willing," Nora said, and smiled up at him with such warmth that he felt his heart expand in his chest. "But I should warn you, I am not an easy woman to court. I have high standards." "Good," Jacob said and kissed her again. "I would expect nothing less." Over the following weeks and months, Jacob courted Nora with all the romance and dedication he had once claimed to disdain. He brought her flowers from the meadows near the Thompson Ranch, wildflowers in brilliant colors that made her smile. He wrote her letters during the week when he was at the ranch, pouring out his thoughts and feelings in a way he had never done with anyone before. He took her on long walks along the Stanislaus River on Sunday afternoons, and they talked about everything from their childhoods to their dreams for the future. Jacob learned about Nora's life before Knights Ferry, about growing up in Ohio as the youngest of 5 children, about meeting James Jenkins when he came through her town on his way west. She had been 18 and he 23, and she had fallen for his kind eyes and gentle manner. He had asked her to marry him after a 3-month courtship, and she had said yes, even though it meant leaving everything she knew to follow him to California. Their marriage had been happy but brief. James had been a good man but not particularly ambitious or practical. He had run the boarding house adequately, but without much success. When he died in the mining accident, Nora had been devastated and terrified, finding herself alone in a rough town with a business that was barely breaking even and creditors demanding payment. "I thought about going home," Nora admitted as they sat on the riverbank one cool November afternoon. "I thought about giving up and running back to Ohio and letting my father take care of everything, but something in me refused to do that. James had brought me here, had believed in this life even if he had not been successful at it. I felt like I owed it to his memory to make something of what he had left behind. And I also felt like I owed it to myself to prove I could be strong, could handle whatever life threw at me." "You more than proved that," Jacob said, taking her hand in his. "You built something remarkable from almost nothing." "I did," Nora said with quiet pride. "And I will not lie, it is satisfying to know I can take care of myself, that I do not need anyone to rescue me or provide for me. But at the same time, it has been lonely. I have kept people at arm's length because I was afraid if I let anyone too close, they might try to take control of what I had built. I have seen too many women lose everything because they trusted the wrong man." "I would never try to take what is yours," Jacob said firmly. "Your boarding house is yours, Nora. If we build a life together, it will be a partnership, not a takeover." "Do you really mean that?" Nora asked, searching his eyes. "Because I need to know, Jacob. I need to know that you see me as an equal, not as someone who needs to be managed or controlled." "I have never met anyone I respect more than you," Jacob said truthfully. "You are the strongest, most capable person I know, man or woman. The idea of trying to control you is not only wrong but laughable. You are a force of nature, Nora Jenkins, and I count myself lucky that you have chosen to let me into your life." Nora kissed him then, a long, deep kiss that left them both breathless. When they finally separated, she said, "I love you, Jacob Sutton. I think I have loved you since the day you came to my defense against those drunk men, even though you were still pretending you did not care about anything or anyone." "I love you too," Jacob said, and felt the truth of those words resonate through his entire being. "I love your strength and your kindness and your refusal to be anything less than exactly who you are. You have changed me, Nora. You have made me believe in things I thought were foolish and impossible. You have given me hope." They spent the rest of that afternoon talking about their future, about what it might look like if they married. Jacob was honest about his concerns, about his fear that his past cynicism had damaged him in ways that might make him a difficult husband. Nora was equally honest about her fear of losing her independence, of being subsumed into someone else's life. "We will have to work at it," Nora said practically. "Marriage is not easy, even when two people love each other. We both have strong personalities and our own ways of doing things. We will disagree and argue and frustrate each other sometimes. But we will also support each other," Jacob said, "and respect each other. And if we approach it as partners rather than as owner and property, then I think we have a real chance of making it work." "I think so too," Nora agreed. "But let us take our time, Jacob. I want to be sure, absolutely certain before we make that commitment." Jacob agreed, even though part of him wanted to propose right then and there. But Nora was right. They needed time to be sure this was real and lasting, not just the flush of new romance that would fade with familiarity. As winter set in, their relationship deepened. Jacob continued his work at the Thompson Ranch, which was now running so smoothly that William Thompson was handling more and more of the day-to-day management himself. Mrs. Thompson had commented more than once that Jacob had worked himself nearly out of a job, which they both knew was the mark of truly effective management. Jacob spent more time in town, often helping Nora with projects around the boarding house. He repaired loose boards on the porch, fixed a persistent leak in the roof, and built new shelves for the pantry. He enjoyed the physical work and the satisfaction of improving the place that Nora had worked so hard to build. The other boarders noticed the change in their relationship, of course. It was impossible to hide the way they looked at each other, the way they found excuses to be near one another. Mrs. Jennings was delighted and told Nora repeatedly that she had never seen two people better suited to each other. The male boarders were respectful and happy for them both, having come to genuinely like and respect Jacob during his months at the boarding house. Christmas came and went in a flurry of activity. Nora decorated the boarding house with pine boughs and candles, and prepared a feast for all the boarders who had nowhere else to go for the holiday. Jacob gave her a beautiful shawl he had bought from a traveling merchant, deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes. Nora gave him a new leather journal, having noticed that he had taken to writing his thoughts down in the evenings. "For all those letters you have been writing me," she said with a smile, "and for anything else you might want to record, your thoughts, your observations, maybe even your feelings." Jacob laughed. "Are you suggesting I have feelings, Miss Jenkins?" "I know for a fact you do, Mr. Sutton," Nora said, kissing him lightly, "and I am very glad of it." In January, Jacob made a decision. He had been thinking about it for weeks, turning it over in his mind, examining it from every angle. Finally, he was sure. He loved Nora Jenkins with everything he had, and he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. The risk of pain or disappointment no longer mattered because the alternative, a life without her, was unthinkable. He bought a ring from the jeweler in Sonora, a simple gold band with a small diamond that had cost him nearly everything he had saved. Then he planned his proposal carefully, wanting it to be perfect for the woman who had changed his entire understanding of what love could be. On a clear Sunday afternoon in late January, Jacob took Nora on a walk to a spot along the river they both loved, a place where the water ran swift and clear over smooth stones, and the trees hung low enough to provide shade in summer. In winter, the trees were bare but still beautiful, their branches etched against the blue sky like fine pen strokes. They sat on a fallen log, watching the river flow past, and Jacob gathered his courage. "Nora, I need to tell you something." "All right," she said, turning to look at him with curiosity and maybe a hint of apprehension. "When I rode into Knights Ferry last summer, I was convinced that romance was foolish and love was a trap. I believed that opening yourself up to another person was the height of stupidity, that anyone who talked about soulmates and true love was either lying or deluded." He paused, taking her hand in his. "You proved me wrong, Nora. You showed me that trust is not foolish but necessary, that faith in another person is not weakness but strength, and that love, real love, is the most powerful and transformative force in the world." Nora's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Jacob, let me finish," he said gently. "I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You have changed me in ways I am still discovering. You have made me want to be better, to be worthy of you. And I know we agreed to take our time, to be sure, before making any big decisions. But I am sure, Nora. I have never been more sure of anything in my life." He slipped off the log and knelt in front of her, pulling the ring from his pocket. "Nora Jenkins, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life loving you and supporting you, and being grateful every single day that you were patient enough to see past my defenses to the man underneath?" Nora was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Jacob, I will marry you. I love you so much, and I want nothing more than to build a life with you." Jacob slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her down to him, kissing her with all the love and joy he felt. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying at the same time, Jacob said, "I never thought I would feel this way. I never thought I could be this happy." "Neither did I," Nora admitted. "After James died, I thought my chance at love had died with him. I thought I would spend the rest of my life alone, and I made peace with that. But then you walked into my boarding house, stubborn and cynical and bleeding, and somehow you became the most important person in my world." They sat together by the river for a long time, making plans and dreaming about their future. They decided to marry in the spring, giving themselves time to make proper arrangements. Nora wanted to keep running the boarding house, at least for now, and Jacob supported that completely. He would continue working at the Thompson Ranch until they figured out what made the most sense long term. Maybe they would eventually buy a small place of their own, or maybe they would make the boarding house their permanent home. The details did not matter as much as the certainty that they would figure it out together. When they returned to the boarding house that evening, they announced their engagement to the other boarders. There were congratulations all around, with Mrs. Jennings crying happy tears and insisting on hosting a celebration dinner. Over the following weeks, news of the engagement spread through town, and Jacob was surprised by how genuinely pleased people seemed to be for them both. "You have made quite an impression," Nora told him one evening as they sat together in the dining room after the other boarders had gone to bed. "People in town have told me repeatedly how glad they are that I found someone. They say you seem like a good man who will treat me well." "I will do my best," Jacob promised. "I know I am not perfect, Nora. I will probably still struggle sometimes with cynicism and pessimism. Old habits die hard." "I do not expect you to be perfect," Nora said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I just expect you to be honest and to keep trying. That is all any of us can do." Winter gradually gave way to spring, and preparations for the wedding moved forward. Nora wrote to her family in Ohio, inviting them to the ceremony. To her surprise and delight, her parents and two of her siblings wrote back saying they would make the journey to California for the occasion. Jacob had no family to invite, his parents long dead and no siblings, but he found he did not mind. The community in Knights Ferry had become his family in a way, and he was content to have them as witnesses to his marriage. They set the date for the first Saturday in May, when the wildflowers would be in bloom and the weather would be warm but not yet oppressively hot. Nora commissioned a new dress from the seamstress in town, a beautiful creation of cream-colored silk with lace at the collar and cuffs. Jacob bought a new suit, dark gray wool that made him look distinguished and handsome. The wedding took place in the small church, where Jacob had first met the Thompsons. The whole town seemed to turn out for the occasion, packing the pews and spilling out into the churchyard. Nora's family sat in the front row, her mother crying quietly into a handkerchief while her father beamed with pride. William and Mrs. Thompson were there, as were Doc Morrison, Samuel from the general store, and dozens of other people Jacob had come to know during his time in Knights Ferry. As Nora walked down the aisle on her father's arm, Jacob felt his breath catch. She was beautiful beyond words, her auburn hair arranged in soft curls, her green eyes shining with joy and love. When she reached his side and took his hand, he felt complete in a way he had never experienced before. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged vows promising to love and honor each other, to be partners in all things, to support each other through whatever challenges life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed Nora with such tenderness and passion that several people in the congregation sighed audibly. The reception was held at the boarding house, which Nora and May had decorated with flowers and ribbons. There was food and music and dancing, and Jacob found himself enjoying the celebration far more than he would have thought possible. He danced with his new wife, with Mrs. Jennings, with Mrs. Thompson, and even with May, who giggled and blushed the entire time. As the sun set and the celebration wound down, Nora's mother pulled Jacob aside. "Take care of my daughter," she said quietly. "She is stronger than most people realize, but that does not mean she does not need someone to lean on sometimes." "I will take care of her," Jacob promised. "And she will take care of me. We are partners, Mrs. Jenkins, equals." "Good," Nora's mother said, patting his arm. "That is exactly what she needs. I am glad she found you, Jacob. I can see how much you love her." "More than anything in the world," Jacob said honestly. That night, Jacob and Nora moved into the largest room in the boarding house. One Nora had been keeping vacant in preparation for their marriage. It was bigger than either of their previous rooms and had been freshly painted and furnished with a new bed, dresser, and chairs. Someone, probably Mrs. Jennings, had left flowers on the dresser and turned down the bed invitingly. As they closed the door behind them, finally alone after the long day, Jacob pulled Nora into his arms. "Hello, Mrs. Sutton," he said, loving the way her new name sounded. "Hello, Mr. Sutton," Nora replied, smiling up at him. "How does it feel to be a married man?" "Like the luckiest person alive," Jacob said and kissed her deeply. They made love that night with tenderness and passion, learning each other's bodies and hearts, cementing the bond they had forged over the past months. Afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Nora said softly, "Thank you for proving yourself wrong, Jacob. Thank you for being brave enough to let me in." "Thank you for being patient with me," Jacob replied. "Thank you for seeing past my defenses to the man I wanted to be. You saved me, Nora. You saved me from a life of loneliness and cynicism." "We saved each other," Nora corrected. "That is what love does. It makes us better than we could be alone." Jacob held her close, marveling at how much his life had changed in less than a year. He had come to Knights Ferry wounded and bitter, convinced that romance was for fools, and that he would spend the rest of his life alone and unattached. But Nora had proven him spectacularly wrong, showing him that love was not a weakness but a strength, that trusting someone was not foolish but brave, and that allowing yourself to be vulnerable was not a guarantee of pain, but a prerequisite for genuine connection and joy. The years that followed were good ones. Jacob continued working at the Thompson Ranch for another year before William felt confident enough to manage it entirely on his own. At that point, Jacob transitioned to helping Nora run the boarding house full-time, taking over the maintenance and repairs while also managing the finances and business side of things. Together, they expanded the operation, adding 4 more rooms and upgrading the facilities. They made a formidable team, their different strengths complementing each other perfectly. Jacob's practical experience and business sense combined with Nora's attention to detail and genuine care for their boarders made the establishment more successful than ever. People came from all over the county to stay at the Sutton boarding house, knowing they would find clean rooms, good food, and a warmth that was rare in the rough mining towns of California. 2 years after their wedding, Nora gave birth to their first child, a boy they named James after her first husband, a gesture that showed the generosity and lack of jealousy in Jacob's character. The baby had Jacob's dark hair and Nora's green eyes, and Jacob was shocked by the intensity of the love he felt for his son the moment he held him for the first time. "I never knew I could feel this much," he confessed to Nora as she rested in their bed, exhausted but radiant. "I thought I had reached the limit of what I could feel when I fell in love with you, but this—" "I know," Nora said, smiling at him. "It is overwhelming, is it not, but also wonderful." They had 2 more children over the next 5 years, a daughter they named Grace and another son they named Thomas. The boarding house rang with the sound of children's laughter, and Jacob discovered he had a patience and gentleness with his children that surprised him. The man who had once been so cynical and closed off became a devoted father who read bedtime stories, built toy horses, and taught his children to ride almost before they could walk. May eventually married a man from the Chinese community and moved out, but she remained close friends with Jacob and Nora, visiting often and bringing her own children to play with the Sutton children. Mrs. Jennings retired from teaching and became a permanent fixture in the Sutton household, serving as grandmother to the children and trusted friend to Jacob and Nora. The years were not without challenges. There were difficult economic times when the mines produced less and fewer people could afford to travel. There were illnesses that swept through the town, requiring careful nursing and constant worry. There were moments when Jacob's old cynicism tried to resurface, usually triggered by some disappointment or betrayal in the wider world beyond their home. But through all of it, Jacob and Nora faced each challenge as partners, supporting each other and refusing to let anything undermine the foundation of love and trust they had built. Jacob learned that while people could disappoint you, the right person would always be there, steady and true. And Nora learned that letting someone in completely, trusting them with your fears and vulnerabilities, could lead to a joy and security she had never imagined possible. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jacob took Nora back to the spot by the river where he had proposed. The children were being watched by Mrs. Jennings, giving them a rare afternoon alone together. They sat on the same fallen log, older now but still perfectly positioned for watching the water flow past. "You remember what you said to me here?" Nora asked, leaning against Jacob's shoulder. "Every word," Jacob said. "I told you that you had proven me wrong about everything I thought I knew about love and romance. And have I continued to prove you wrong?" Nora asked teasingly. "Every single day," Jacob said, kissing the top of her head. "Every single day you show me that love is not foolish but essential, that romance is not a trap but a gift, and that trusting someone completely is the bravest and most worthwhile thing a person can do." "You know," Nora said thoughtfully, "when you first walked into my boarding house, bleeding and stubborn and determined to keep the world at arm's length, I never imagined we would end up here. I saw something in you, some potential for more, but I had no idea how deeply I would come to love you or how completely you would open yourself up to me." "I had no idea either," Jacob admitted. "I was so sure I had everything figured out, so convinced that I was protecting myself by staying alone. But you showed me I was just limiting myself, cutting myself off from the best things life has to offer. You changed everything for me, Nora. You are everything to me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the river and enjoying the rare peace of an afternoon away from the demands of the boarding house and their children. Then Nora said, "I am pregnant again." Jacob sat up straight, looking at her with surprise and joy. "Are you sure?" "Quite sure," Nora said, smiling. "I have suspected for a few weeks now, but I wanted to be certain before I told you. We are going to have another child, Jacob." Jacob pulled her into his arms, holding her close and feeling gratitude wash over him. 4 children, a successful business, a wife he loved more with each passing year, a life filled with purpose and connection and joy. It was more than he had ever dreamed possible back when he was a bitter, cynical man convinced that romance was for fools. "I love you," he said fiercely. "I love you and our children and the life we have built together. Thank you, Nora. Thank you for proving me wrong." "I love you too," Nora said, and kissed him with all the passion and tenderness of a decade of marriage. "And I will keep proving you wrong for the rest of our lives." The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new joys. The 4th child, a daughter they named Nora's mother's name, Martha, was born healthy and strong. The boarding house continued to thrive, becoming one of the most respected establishments in the entire county. Their children grew up happy and loved, learning from their parents' example what a true partnership looked like. Jacob never entirely lost his tendency toward skepticism, but it was tempered now by experience and love. When he found himself doubting human nature or growing cynical about the world, he would look at Nora and remember how wrong he had been about so many things. He would watch his children playing in the yard and feel grateful that he had been brave enough to let Nora past his defenses all those years ago. And Nora continued to be the fierce, determined woman who had captured his heart that first summer in Knights Ferry. She ran the boarding house with competence and care, raised their children with wisdom and love, and never stopped challenging Jacob to be better, to be more open, to embrace the fullness of life rather than holding himself apart from it. On their 20th wedding anniversary, when their oldest son James was nearly 18 and the youngest, Martha, was 7, Jacob organized a surprise celebration. He had their children help him decorate the boarding house, hanging ribbons and flowers everywhere. He hired musicians from Sonora to come and play. He invited everyone they knew in Knights Ferry and the surrounding area. When Nora came home from visiting a sick friend in town, she walked into a house full of people shouting surprise. She stood in the doorway, overwhelmed, her hand going to her heart as she took in the scene. Then her eyes found Jacob, standing in the center of it all, and she smiled with such love and joy that he felt his heart expand in his chest. "What is all this?" she asked, making her way through the crowd to his side. "This is me celebrating the fact that 20 years ago, I was lucky enough to marry the most extraordinary woman in the world, Jacob said, taking her hands in his. This is me thanking you for 2 decades of love and partnership and happiness I did not even know was possible. Nora's eyes filled with tears. Jacob, you did not have to do all this. Yes, I did, Jacob said firmly. Because you deserve to know how much you mean to me, how grateful I am every single day that you were patient with a stubborn, cynical fool who thought he knew everything. You were not a fool, Nora said softly. You were wounded. There is a difference. Either way, you healed me, Jacob said. You showed me what real love looks like. You proved to me that romance is not foolish but beautiful, that trust is not weakness but strength, and that opening your heart to another person is the most worthwhile risk you can take. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her in front of all their friends and family and neighbors, not caring who saw or what they thought. After 20 years of marriage, he was still as in love with Nora as he had been the day he proposed by the river. Possibly more so, because now he understood fully what a gift it was to love and be loved in return. The celebration went on late into the night, with music and dancing and stories shared by people whose lives had been touched by Jacob and Nora over the years. Former boarders came back to thank them for providing a home away from home. Business associates praised their integrity and fairness. Friends spoke of their generosity and kindness. But for Jacob, the best moment of the night came after everyone had gone home and the children were finally asleep. He and Nora stood on the porch of the boarding house, looking out at the quiet street and the stars overhead. Nora was leaning against him, his arm around her waist, and they were simply being together in comfortable silence. "Thank you for tonight," Nora said finally. "It was wonderful, but more than that, it reminded me of how lucky I am. When James died, I thought my chance at happiness had died with him. I thought I would spend the rest of my life going through the motions, taking care of business but never really living. Then you showed up, all prickly and defensive and determined not to feel anything, and somehow you became the great love of my life." "I am the lucky one," Jacob said. "I was so lost when I came here, so convinced that I had everything figured out, but I did not know anything, not really. You taught me what matters, Nora. You taught me how to live, how to love, how to be vulnerable and brave at the same time." "We taught each other," Nora said. "That is what a good marriage is, I think. 2 people helping each other become better versions of themselves." They stood there for a long while, holding each other and watching the night sky, and Jacob felt a contentment so deep and complete that he could hardly believe it was real. But it was real. All of it, the love, the family, the life they had built together, was gloriously, undeniably real. As they finally went inside and climbed the stairs to their bedroom, Jacob thought about the man he had been when he first arrived in Knights Ferry. That man had believed romance was foolish, had been convinced that love was a trap and trust a weakness. That man had been wrong about everything that mattered. Nora had proven him wrong with her fierce strength and tender heart. She had shown him that romance was not foolish but essential, that love was not a trap but a liberation, and that trust was not a weakness but the foundation of everything worthwhile in life. She had taken a bitter, cynical man and taught him how to hope again, how to believe again, how to love without reservation or fear. And Jacob spent the rest of his life being grateful for that gift, for the fierce woman who had proven him wrong and changed his life forever. They grew old together in that boarding house in Knights Ferry, surrounded by their children and eventually their grandchildren, building a legacy not of wealth or fame but of love and partnership, and the simple, profound truth that opening your heart to another person is the bravest and most rewarding thing any human can do. When Jacob was an old man, sitting on that same porch with silver hair and weathered hands, with Nora beside him still fierce and beautiful despite her own advancing years. He would sometimes think back to that summer day in 1876, when he rode into town bleeding and alone, convinced he had everything figured out. And he would smile at his own foolishness, grateful beyond words that a certain auburn-haired woman with green eyes and a stubborn chin had been patient enough to prove him wrong about everything that mattered. Their love story became something of a legend in Knights Ferry, the tale of the cynical cowboy and the fierce widow who found each other and built something beautiful together. People would point to them as proof that it was never too late to change, never too late to open your heart, never too late to discover that romance was not foolish, but the most wonderful, transformative force in the world. And every time someone told their story, Jacob would squeeze Nora's hand and thank whatever providence had brought him to Knights Ferry on that hot summer day so many years ago. Because everything good in his life, everything that mattered, had started the moment he walked through the door of Nora Jenkins's boarding house and met the woman who would prove him wrong in the best possible way.